talk will be moderated by Svetlana. So Svetlana, I'll give you the floor. Please do not forget to test the option of sharing screen. All right. Thank you.
I'm waiting for 16 o'clock.
Hi, Sveta. Yeah. So should I test screen sharing right now? Okay, good.
Yes, you can test, and we'll start at 16 o'clock. You can prepare.
Yeah. I guess you can see my screen right now, right?
And see, but would you full
Sure. I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I'll do that.
Yes,
okay.
Wonderful.
Good. I stopped sharing temporarily. Okay.
You can leave this. You can. It's convenient for you.
I think I would temporarily stop sharing and then re-share again, like 4 minutes from now, 3 minutes from now, actually. I hope my co-authors and co-presenters are also here. Some of them are actually afield and trying to connect from Far East, but I hope it will work out. Good.
May I ask, did they register for this call? Because in case they did not, then they did not receive the link. Shall we send you the link or just transfer them to them?
Sure, I took courage to forward the link to them. Was it the best step? I forwarded the link myself to them.
Well, if you did so, it's all right. I mean, those are your co-authors, right? Those are the people. I mean,
I should have asked, but it only occurred to me too late.
All right.
Until the last moment, I was not sure whether they would be able to join us or not, being in the field.
All right. Yeah. Good.
Well, it's 16 o'clock. Nina, do you hear me? We can start our next session. I hope Mikhail will be here now. And we will start with a panel lecture of Professor Mikhail Daniel from Linguistic Convergence Laboratory of HSE University. And maybe we can wait for 1 minute for him. I hope. Well, Mikhail, you are welcome. We are starting now.
Right. I think that Anton Buzanov is trying to get in. Should I admit him? He's one of the co-authors.
Oh, okay.
So
I will introduce you.
Sure.
One more.
Okay.
I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Mikhail Daniel, from Linguistic Convergence Laboratory of HSE University, and he will present the work which was co-authored by Margarita Popova, Anton Buzanov, and Ekaterina Voloshina. Mikhail will be talking about on the topic size matters, probing the size effects in gender assignment in 4 East Caucasian languages. All the participants are very welcome to ask questions in the chat during the lecture, and we will ask Mikhail to answer in the very end. So, Mikhail, could you start, please?
Yeah. I hope you can see my screen, and you can see it in the presentation mode. Good. So as Sveta already said, this is a co-authored paper by Rita Popova, Anton Buzanov, Katya Voloshina, and myself, mostly based on Rita Popova's BA thesis project that she defended a few weeks ago, and on the immense amount of work she invested into data collection, experiment studies, and data annotation. One thing that I should say from the very start is that at least myself, but also I would say my co-authors, are anything but experimental linguists, so we are very much honored to be invited here. But rather as people who need advice rather than prepared to teach you something about experimental linguistics. And unlike other presentations in this conference, we're not talking about experiments run on speakers, at least some of them, on speakers of minority languages, but on trying to use, it's a slightly different design of the research. We're trying to use experimental data obtained elsewhere in interpretation of the data from minority languages. You will see how it works. Oops. Yeah. Okay. So our research question is connected to a well-known typological observation that rules of gender assignment, so rules of nominal classification, of putting different nouns into different genders, is sometimes affected by the size of the referent of the noun. So roughly bigger nouns denoting bigger objects or entities go to one gender, and or nouns denoting smaller entities go to another gender. And in this talk, we are trying to do 3 different things. First, we're trying to do such claims more conceptual specific. So what we want to come to a better understanding of what people mean when they say that size affect gender assignment. Second, we want to, based on this first step, I want to suggest some methodologies of testing these claims, because as far as we know, to the best of our knowledge, so far these tests have been more qualitative than quantitative. So third, we are going to apply these methods in a pilot study to several related languages, in some of which, but not all, these effects have been reported, and to see what happens, whether our methods support qualitative observations by previous scholars who worked on these languages and on these topics. We're going to talk briefly about previous discussions. Then we are suggesting a classification of size effects into several groups, several distinct groups. And we think this is important for further studies in the domain. Then a very important part had to be omitted, a typological survey of size effects in gender assignment, because for the sake of time. Then we will suggest our hypothesis and then discuss our data sets, models, and results of these models. Okay, so here are several brief references to previous discussion of size effects in East Caucasian. These are language family of my expertise, and that was why I suggested to test these models on East Caucasian. So Zhirkov, discussing LAK data, LAK is a separate branch within East Caucasian language family, alias North Dagestanian, says in our translation, in the reconstruction of the original system of gender assignment, gender 3 was assigned to all animals, natural phenomena, round-shaped, and large objects. So one of the categories he points to in trying to interpret the history of gender assignment, the gender assignment proto-LAK is to highlight the role of size as one of the factors. Corbett and then Corbett and Fedden discussing Archi data, basically derived from discussion in the book by Alexander Evgenievich Kibrik on Archi, notes that prototypical members of gender 3 are large, and while typical members of gender 4 are nothing. So they do not have any kind of size. They are not qualified in terms of size. So he says that gender 3 is big. And similarly, in a later discussion, he also says that if you don't know anything about the size, you can't make good predictions about gender assignment. But if you know something implied, then you can make better predictions about gender assignment. I should have mentioned that in the languages that we're discussing here, the number of genders is 4 and not 3, as in the languages that some of you might be more used to, where gender 1 is the gender for males, so our roughly masculine gender. Gender 2 is a gender for females, while gender 3 and gender 4 are not very well predictable, right? And one of the points in Zhirkov and Corbett and Kibrik discussion of the distribution between gender 3 and gender 4, so non-human genders, is that size has a goal in this decision where a noun is going to be placed. The obvious research question here is whether these observations made by Zhirkov and by Kibrik and then by Corbett, followed by Corbett, can they result from cherry picking? They do not provide any counts. They provide examples, sometimes very extensive examples, but it's still not clear whether we could not achieve similar tables of comparable sizes simply by occasionally by picking lexical items that comply with this hypothetical distribution, while other lexical items would disprove this generalization. So the question is whether this is cherry picking or their observations can be corroborated by independent lexical sampling. And a related question is it true that Archi is indeed similar to LAK? Because both for LAK and Archi, the size effects have been suggested. Then Archi is to other Lesgic languages, because Archi belongs to one branch of East Caucasian, North Dagestanian language family, and LAK belongs to a totally different one, a totally different branch, unrelated branches. So can it be true that Archi and LAK, which are indeed in close contact between each other, are more similar to each other than Archi is similar to other Lesgic languages? Or maybe similar effects can also be observed in other Lesgic languages, but simply people didn't pay attention. Or these effects are weaker and so less salient, and people didn't notice them, but they are there, just hidden because they are weaker. Okay. So the non-experimental part of the talk is trying to discuss 4 different types of what we call size effects in gender assignment, how size of the referent can play out in the rules of gender assignment. There are 4 different hypothetical types of ways of how size can be important, and we'll walk through the 4 of them in turn. We will call them reference size effect, pairwise size effect, category size effect, and absolute size effect. So, reference size effect is a very tangible thing. People have noticed that the same noun can belong to either gender 3 or gender 4, and then the reference of this noun will be different in size. For instance, there is a word spoon, which belongs to gender 4. But if this is a big spoon, essentially level, then it belongs to gender 3. Or the default gender for the word finger is gender 3, but this word can shift to gender 4 and to designate little finger, digitus minimus, right? Or it has been observed also in the text that the word fox, which is essentially a word lexically a word in gender 3, can shift to gender 4 with different evaluative or size effects. So it may be, small fox, smaller than usual, or naughty fox, a fox that we evaluate depreciatively. Or a recent data shows that the word paw, so the extremity of an animal, can also, which is usually in gender 3, can also shift to gender 4. And my informant told me that yes, you can say that if you are talking to a child. Like for Russian speakers here, like when you can say lapka to a child in reference to her or his hand, right? Small paw, literally. But this effect is lexically constrained. Not all object nouns can shift between gender 3 and gender 4. Now, pairwise size effects in Archi. It can be described that in a pair of nouns which designate structurally similar objects, the smaller noun, the noun with a smaller referent would go to gender 4, and the noun with a larger referent goes to gender 3. The difference from reference size effects is that here we deal with different nouns, not with the same noun. In reference size effect, you have the same noun shifting between gender 3 and gender 4. In this case, pairwise size effects, you have pairs of nouns, like city and village, or gates and door, or house and room. And Kivrik observes that in such pairs, it's consistently gender 4 hosts nouns with smaller objects, smaller concepts, let's say, and gender 3 hosts nouns for bigger objects, right? We are not going to test referent and pairwise size effects below. We don't even yet know of ways to create such data sets as to be able to test this. But the fact that the same noun may be put into different genders when it's of different sizes, we take this as hard evidence for the size effects in Archi. And as a starting point, so we look at this data and say, hello, so we have really data which shows us some importance of size for Archi. Then maybe we should also quantitatively test those cases where it's not as tangible as in other cases, as in the case of reference size. So we should also test what we'll refer to as category size and absolute size in a few seconds. And also see that no size-related flexible gender, so reference size, has been reported for Lak, Rutul, or Tsakhur. So we know that size is present as a factor of gender assignment in Archi because we have hard evidence for this, reference size. But we have no such hard evidence for Lak, Rutul, and Tsakhur. And so that's why we want to run all our tests also on these 3 languages. Okay, so next comes category size. We describe as category size effect and exemplify it here in Archi, where you have a distribution of nouns within the same conceptual category, here like animals, domestic animals, domestic animals. So baby animals go to gender 4 and adult animals go to gender 3. So within the category, you have the distribution between smaller representatives of the lexical category, of the conceptual category, and bigger representatives of the same category. That we call category size. Finally, there are some other examples of how category size effect works in Archi. You have not only domestic animals, but also wild animals. You also have birds. And we have birds. Yeah, that's the 3 category that Kiblik suggested that category size works. Finally, absolute size effect is the most abstract way how size may influence the gender assignment in a language. So if we make a very general statement like small objects are in gender 4 and big objects are in gender 3, they do not form pairs as in pairwise size effects. They do not belong to the same category. But roughly, if you think of a big object, there are high chances that it would end up in gender 3. And if you think of a really small object, then there are high chances for it to end up in gender 4. And there are some indications that can be interpreted in this way in the discussion of gender in East Caucasian. For instance, Zhirkov, I remind again, I requote this. He simply says, and large objects. He doesn't say large animals, or large trees, or large buildings. He says large objects. Also, Korbek in 91 says, we may say that prototypical members of gender 3 are large, without indicating that they belong to a special category, even though in the very next sentence, he continues, this includes larger animals, which might be an indication that this is category size in the end. And that's why I think at some point in this study, we decided to very consistently distinguish between category size and absolute size, and to run different experiments to be able to detect for such effects. So again, before I go further, I just wanted to remind you that we have 4 possible, maybe more, but we thought only of 4 possible implementations of size effects in the language. First, this is referent size, when the same noun belongs to different genders. Second, pairwise size, where 2 similar nouns belong to different genders, depending on the size. Then category size, where nouns in a specific conceptual category are distributed between gender 3 and gender 4 in correlation with their size. And finally, absolute size. So very generally, something that is thought to be big goes to gender 3, as something that is thought to be small goes to gender 2 and gender 4. Sorry, and again, we do not test the first 2 hypotheses, the reference size and the pairwise size. We only test category size and absolute size. There is a very nice and interesting and informative and dense discussion of typological data prepared by Rita. But Rita, I'm sorry, we have to drop this for the sake of time, because of the limitation of time. Okay, so this is a summary. Roughly, it says that there is no direct evidence in the typological discussion of the presence of absolute size. Some examples of category size effects, but no clear discussion of absolute size effects, maybe for classifier systems, but not for gender systems. And if we come up with tangible absolute size effects in our languages by our methods, that would be a good result, because that sounds new in this respect. Okay, so we have two hypotheses. We are hypothesis 1 can be formulated like small objects go to gender 4 and or big objects go to gender 3. This is absolute size hypothesis. So independently of anything, big objects go to 3 and small objects go to 4. And what we use to test it is easily Fisher exact test, as I will show later. But then the hypothesis 2 is that within specific conceptual categories, smaller objects tend to be in gender 4, and or bigger objects tend to be in gender 3. And this is a different type of data, different data set that we're using, and we are using a different model to test this. This is Mann-Whitney test. I have a visual support for how a Mann-Whitney test works, but probably people here know it already. So again, for the sake of time, I may want to drop this. Very briefly, you see that in some cases there are non-perfect division between two categories here, green and red. And you see roughly that red are more dense in the right part of the scale, and greens are more dense on the left part of the scale. But you have to see whether this is statistically significant observation or this is might result from chance. Okay, so this is what Mann-Whitney test does. Okay, so these are our two hypotheses and two tests. And so next, what we do is we need to map a collection of objects stacked for size onto nominal classifications of the languages in question. So we need to see whether bigness and smallness maps well onto nominal classifications in the 4 languages. But the problem is, and I think that might be most important for our audience for today, and maybe that's where your feedback is most valuable. How do we decide which objects are big or bigger, and which objects are small or smaller? Where from do we get this type of tagging or annotation? So we used 3 data sets. One data set comes from a study by McRae et al. 2005, in which quite a few native English speakers were presented with, again, quite a few nouns. And what they were asked to do was to suggest some parameters which are relevant, or qualities or features. Let's say parameters. I think that's closest. Parameters that are relevant for this concepts. They were free in choosing the parameters, so they did not rate every concept by every parameter. And so what we get as a result, there were quite a few parameters, but we were only looking on size-related parameters, which were is large or is small. And we see that words that have been tagged as large or small in this experiment most frequently indeed seem to correlate with size. So elephant was tagged for is large most often, and flea was tagged for is small also most often. Another experiment comes 10 years later by Binder et al. And it has a slightly different design. Again, even more native English speakers have been presented with roughly the same amount of nouns, but every noun needed to be tagged or qualified by all 65 pre-established semantic features. And people could, and the subject could have chosen that being big is associated with chair very much, or somewhat, or being big is not relevant at all for this concept, or the subject could have said that this is not applicable to this concept at all. So this is the second data set, and again, we focused on large and small. Fortunately, these are important qualities which are mentioned in both experiments. So we could use the output of the experiments for our purpose. Finally, yeah, so this is the top big objects and top small objects in binder tau. And again, you see that this seems intuitively quite reliable type of tagging for size. So whale is big and mountain is big, but ant and mosquito are small. And finally, we ran our own experiment on Russian speakers. First, it was about 100 speakers, but now the number has doubled. But today, we only present the data, the results based on the first run of the experiment. So about 100 speakers. So every participant was free to name as many big objects as he wanted within 10 minutes, or he could drop earlier, of course. Nobody would survive 10 minutes in this experiment. So then that 10 minutes was only an upper limit. Usually people would spend on this 1 minute or 2 minutes, not more. And then, similarly to compile a list of small objects. So here, unlike the previous experience, we didn't have any fixed list of concepts. The subject was invited to name all big objects that would come to his mind. Okay, so there are some numbers here and some limitations also. We asked participants not to name, to name only entities that supposedly are known to 19th century speakers, so as to avoid modern concepts that are most likely not present in a traditional classification and not present in dictionaries on which we're based. And we also asked them to avoid diminutives, singulatives, and multi-word constructions, so as to arrive at concepts which are more likely to be lexicalized, to be represented by a lexical item in a target language. So you see here that top bigs and top smalls in our experiment are also, well, they're good. Needle and ring are relatively small, and mountain and elephant are relatively big. That's true. They are, and so that's not a chance that they got to the top of our experiment. So next step, I will almost not discuss it, though maybe it was the most painstakingly laborious part of Rita's work. So based on this quite large list of concepts, we needed to map these concepts onto words. We used dictionaries, various types of lexical data. We additionally elicited some missing items, but not all of them. And of course, there were multiple issues with this mapping. If we want, we can come back to these issues later, but I just trust me that there were so many problems that most of the time in the study has been spent on solving them. Maybe, or not less than a half, let's say. So we then used some threshold to filter out really big objects, well, not really big objects, but bigger objects, let's say, and smaller objects from our big and small experiments, for both 3 experiments, right? And so we got groups of big objects and small objects distributed after Rita's mapping onto lexical data between 3rd gender and 4th gender, and that's an ideal design for future exact. So you have a table. Let me show you. Yeah, here you have a table where one of the experiments. This specifically is experiments run by ourselves. You have big object and small objects distributed between gender 3 and 4, and hooray, you have a correlation that we kind of expected. I mean, I wouldn't say we expected it, but at least that was this correlation is supports the qualitative observations in previous studies. In Archi, in both Archi and Lock, you observe the absolute size effect, but not in all data sets. So this effect is observed indeed in our data set, but not in binder and Macrae data set. While when you apply the same methodology to Rutul and Tsakhur data, where such correlations have not been discussed in literature, we do not find any size effect related size effects substantiated by our data. So, in relation to our methodology of testing the hypothesis, we do see the difference between Archi and LOC in the sense that some of the data sets do support the hypothesis for Archi and LOC, but the same methodology and same data sets do not see size effects, do not detect size effects for the other languages where we did not expect them to be found. Now, how do you run an experiment with category size now? So we have collections of ontological categories ready for testing. Kibrik and Kadzasov is a thesaurus for East Caucasian languages, where you have nouns with their genders, and they are split into categories like animals, tools, and some others. But obviously, Kibrik did not rate these elements of the categories for the size. He would just put all animals into one category, but he would not decide whether badger is bigger than a rabbit or vice versa, or fox is smaller than a wolf. So how to rate relative sizes of noun members of the same category? Like, what is bigger, hand or leg? Or rather, arm or leg, let's say. Because, yeah, okay, or nose or ear. So what we did was a card sorting experiment. I forgot. Well, okay. In the end, I can thank deeply Olga Fedorova, who suggested some specifically this experiment design. So the participant is asked to group nouns into sets based on the size of the reference and provide names for these sets. So the good example. Oops, sorry. Yeah. Okay, I'll go later to this. So you need to classify the cards, putting the cards with, for instance, different animals that you judge to be of the same size into the same category, and give a name to this category so that afterwards Rita or myself could decide which category is bigger or smaller. So we did not ask the subjects to order the categories themselves. We used their names, their labels for the categories they suggested to order the categories by size. So we used 4 conceptual categories: animals, birds, tools, and body parts. And each participant rated at least one category, but some rated more. And then we averaged the rank across participants. Let me show you one of the categorization classifications that we obtained from one specific subject, so that you see how it works. And I think this is a lucky one. Some others have been much more problematic. So you have, I'm sorry, here we didn't insert the translations for the concepts, but the first category includes deer, crocodile, lion, bear, etc. The second includes mare, cow, calf, she-calf, horse, etc. Then the next one includes ram, sheep, dog, etc. And then the other one includes squirrel, hare, frog, badger, hen, etc. And the subject also provided the labels for this category. So he labeled them herself as maxi, midi, mini, and micro mini. So it's here it's uncontroversially mapped onto size scale here, obviously. So but yet we need to remember that groups were ordered by ourselves and not by the subjects. And in some cases, it was much more much more difficult. For instance, some of our participants complained that that classifying sizes of body parts depends on whose body part it is. Like a size of a rooster is, a tail of a rooster is of a different size as compared to a tail of a lizard or a tail of an elephant, let's say, right? Some of the categories naturally split into groups or classes that were independent of sizes. It was very hard for our subjects to abstract themselves from this type of classification. So some of the tools would naturally split into, let's say, big and long tools, and it was unclear how to relate them between each other, because both long and big spherical, though there are not so many spherical tools, fortunately, but yet. So big in other dimensions, in different dimensions, so flatly big and elongated things are both big, but in different senses. And so now we had problems with ordering these types of classification then. But somehow, maybe sometimes making some partly arbitrary solutions, we came up with a classification that with ranking that looked like that. So, for instance, birds start from a sparrow and end with heron, and it seems like it does correlate with size. Or if you rate animals, you start with an elephant and end with bull and ox. Quite close to each other, and also that this does. So this is top. Sorry, yeah, I'm sorry. This is top big animals. Yeah.
I'm sorry. You have about 7 minutes left.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah, and I'll be. So these are our results of our card sorting experiment, and what we the statistical model that we run on this experiment, because this is already, as you can see, especially from birds, this is a scale of size. This is not only big objects and small objects, as in the previous experiment, as in absolute size effects, but this is a relative ranking by size within a category. So we have a scale here. And naturally, when you got a scale, you can apply a Mann-Whitney test for analysis, and to see whether the genders of gender 3 and gender 4 assignment of these norms is randomly mixed or it's displaced relative to each other on a scale. So what you get here is that for Archi, you do have the expected result for animals and birds, but do not get the same result for tools. And in fact, it's even the other way around. So tools do not comply as a category to the size effects. In LAC or in Rutul or in Tsakhur, you don't get the expected result. If you get anything, you get a different result. Like you have gender 4 is bigger for Rutul, so Rutul does not show the same type of effect as expected. So maybe I just jump to the conclusions now. Here. Our results are compatible with previous qualitative observations on East Caucasian languages. Apparently discarding the zero cherry-picking hypothesis. So what the generalization suggested by Kivrik and then followed up by Corbett and Fedden do not result from cherry-picking to our eyes. Also, we see that for Archi, we confirm both absolute size hypothesis and categorical size hypothesis, and of course pairwise size and the reference size that has not been tested for other languages in our study. While for LAC, we only see absolute size effect, but do not detect any categorical size effect, at least within the same categories. And for Tsakhur, we see neither, nor categorical size effect or absolute size effect. And I think these results are promising in the sense that they support the previous observations made in descriptive literature or not made in descriptive literature. Because for Tsakhur and Rutul, no one ever suggested that size was an important predictor for gender assignment. While for Locke, it has only formulated in terms of absolute size. Remember Zhirkov's quotation before. While for Archi, it has been specified at both absolute size and it has been formulated both in terms of absolute size and categorical size. So we may hope the method is scalable to other languages where the same claims have not been made before, because people might have overlooked the size effects. Kibrik has worked on Archi for years and years and had a very good grasp of the empirical data and very good intuitions of the language, right? In other languages where some size effects are attested, you can use this method, you can try to use this method to see whether this does not result from cherry picking after all. For some other languages where the same effects have not been attested, you can test whether you can see any kind of size effects, possibly overlooked by previous researchers. Okay, so of course there are many shortcomings. You have noticed already, and I have heard a glimpse of the discussion after the previous talk, which has been related to culturally specific, linguistic relativity in short, let's say. So you have noticed that we have used the data from English speakers and Russian speakers to test size effects across Archi, Rutul, Tsakhur, and Locke speakers, which obviously represent different cultures. We try to make our data sets culturally independent, but still we don't know how people see different concepts in terms of size. So one way to develop the study would be to go to make experiments in the field, after all, something that we try to avoid as much as we could because of the various current conditions. Size effects may be present in the language, but hidden by other effects. So, for instance, I didn't mention that, but dwarfs and giants would go to gender 1 if they're males, or gender 2 if they're females, simply because they are males and females. And there are some others assignment rules that simply override size effects. So sex affiliation overrides size effects in all cases. And my suspicion is that the strange effect that we've got for tools in Rutul, I think, is also results from the fact that that tools simply go to one gender rather than the other. Also, it would be interesting to see whether we can robustly test for pairwise effects, something that we didn't do. But then we need to think of a way to elicit data sets of pairs. So we need to think to ask questions like, please think of a pair of objects that are of different size, but similar otherwise. It's a very difficult task for a subject. So we need to think of some kind of a sensible experiment design. Or, for instance, maybe more easy is to think of other relations which imply size differences, like part-whole relations. Parts are usually smaller than the wholes. So if we use an ontology which contains part-whole relations, then we can try to build a data set based on this ontology with parts and wholes, and to see whether this type of relation also correlates with size effects. Maybe there are other shortcomings that we simply don't see, and other ways to develop this this study. And then, so we came to the end. That's the end of story.
Thank you so much, Mikhail, for your presentation. So perfect time and for very interesting and even exciting presentation. I think it will be useful for next researcher, for next studies. And we have some questions in the chat. I will read it to you, and could you answer?
I can read them, I think.
Yourself, but it aloud. If
I
it's
mean,
Okay.
I can also unmute Maria who asked the question. Maybe it will be like more convenient for the discussion. Shall I?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Or I mean, at least to ask her to turn on her mic.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And actually, I have just a question or a suggestion. Did you look at the so-called child-directed speech, right? Because if these languages have just have such a variety, right? Because I think that it would be very interesting to look at how the gender assignment behaves there. Because actually there are some works concerning child-directed speech which show that actually the factor that plays a very huge role there is the deviation from the norm. Right? When you look at Russian child-directed speech, you will see many diminutives there, right? And for example, if you look at Besseman child-directed speech, Besseman does not have diminutives, but there is a very interesting effect that if you the same word is very rude, very obsolete when you use it so adult-directed, and it's absolutely normal when you use a child-directed, right? And if there will be some deviations in gender assignment in child-directed speech, I think it could also support your hypothesis that it is not the absolute size that matters, then the deviation from the norm, right, which these augmentatives and diminutives deal with.
Masha, thank you very much. That's a very useful comment. Actually, I mentioned one of the words, one of the kind of piece of related evidence in the talk when I was talking about using the paw as a gesture to a child.
Right. That's why I asked the question, because
yes. I think that's a very good idea, because that's where you can. There are actual doublets, child-directed doublets for lexical items, and you can indeed try to check whether in this type of environment a concept, let's say, not a noun, because it's not the same noun which is used in child-directed speech in Archi and in other East Caucasian languages, but they are doublets, a usual one and a child-directed one, and it would be very interesting indeed to check whether this correlates with shift to gender 4, and also this is relatively easy to check in the other 3 languages in question. The only reserve that I have is that it is not directly related, or not necessarily directly related to size effect, but this would support our hypothesis of size effects by implication, because typologically, evaluative gender and child-related speech correlates with size. Then, by seeing a similar result in Archi, you would indirectly support the generalizations that size matters in Archi. If that's the way you meant it, I wholeheartedly support the idea. I just wanted to say that we wanted really to focus on true size in a sense, not on size-related things like hypochoristics. Even though they are present in Archi, as I mentioned, also in a fairy tale, a fox went to gender 4 simply because she was referred to as a naughty fox, not a very good fox. So it was depreciative use of diminutive, let's say. But this is not true size, right? But yes, I think this is a very worthy. That's very much worth doing. Yeah, thank you. That didn't occur to us to control for this systematically.
Thank you for a very interesting question. And we have another question from Dmitry Zelensky. Could you unmute yourself and?
I can see the question. I can read it out. I admit I don't understand why these findings are surprising. Aren't natural language scales like size always relative to a reference class? I have to say that I can read it aloud, but I'm not sure I can I understand the question. Maybe Dmitry should unmute him after all and maybe explain a little bit. Just to repeat, our point was that we were checking whether gender assignment correlates with size in one or other way.
Yes, and you found it correlates with relative size akin to other objects of the class, such as for tools which are elongated, you find the correlation to longer tools of the same form and stuff. And you seem to have presented it as surprising, as something you wouldn't expect of a natural language category, which is somehow correlated with size. And
no, maybe just my accents were wrong a little bit. We were trying to test whether we have lexical evidence for size being relevant in different ways in these four languages. That's all. So it was not that absolute size or category size was more category size effects or absolute size effects were more or less were more or less unexpected for us. I think that what we wanted to say was that okay. So my intuition is that within a category, it's more easy to see how the size is relevant and important than in absolute terms. I think that absolute size effect is was more difficult to substantiate empirically. That was the idea than within categories. So we ran both experiments, and to tell you the truth, all the time Rita was pretty much skeptical about absolute size effects, as far as I remember. Much less skeptical about category size effect and more skeptical about absolute size effect. And also in her typological survey, she found several references to category size effects in other languages, but almost never to absolute size effects for gender assignment list. So in a sense, absolute gender effects were a little bit more surprising to us, and we took them with a bigger grain of salt than category size effects for Archi. In this way, some of the results were less expected for us than the others. But I don't think that maybe if you got it the way that we thought that category size was less expected, just maybe I didn't make my accents correctly. Okay, is it more clear now, Dima?
I think it's clear.
Okay, good. So, Irina Sikerina, yeah. How does it?
Question from Irina Sikerina. I ask you to unmute, and if you could ask your question.
Sure. Михаил, спасибо. Но у меня вот два наивных вопроса. Почему это считается...
Could you please speak in English? We have some...
Okay, so my question was about whether this is actually gender system, whether you could specify the fact that there are some grammatical features that show that the noun belongs to gender 1 or gender 2, and whether there is gender agreement in these languages. Normally, you would expect that to be grammatically specified as opposed to classifiers that are semantically specified. When I was listening to you, I was thinking, why aren't these classifiers? Why are these gender classes? Could you?
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, sure. Indeed, I told nothing about the gender architecture of the languages, so I'm sorry for this gap. But this is a regular gender. Yeah, it's omnipresent in agreement systems. It's nothing like classifiers. So classifiers are usually less grammaticalized, as you said, much more numerous. They're not usually used in agreement, though there are some South American languages where the border between classifiers and gender agreement is much more flexible, is much more much unclear. But East Caucasian languages are in many senses, at least in the senses that you're asking for, they're typical gender systems. So you have nouns as controllers. All nouns are distributed between 3 to 5 genders to 6 genders, depending on the language of the family. Gender is not expressed except exceptionally, is not expressed on the noun itself. So it's unlike Bantu. And it's much more like Indo-European gender in this sense, and but targets are scattered all over the clause, including in some languages adjectives, in many languages, in most languages, most verbs, some adverbs. It's amazing system and very unusual system in many respects, but in the respect that you are asking for, this is a typical gender system. So it's controller, target, and deeply, the whole grammatical system of East Caucasian languages, or most of them, is like, has roots of gender go in all directions. So it's typical gender system, yeah. You're also asking whether phonological features are at play.
On the nouns.
That has been suggested. And it seems they are to a certain extent at play. There have been several research that show that phonological form of the noun also influences gender assignment. But that seems to be more, you need to test for this. This is not very visible. You need to test for this. So yes, phonology may play a role, but you need to apply statistical testing. And that leads us to another more complicated thing. Is maybe I mentioned that in one of the shortcomings of the talk, but we were looking only at size and disregarding all other types and factors of gender assignment. So in a different approach, you would use a tree classifier or a multifactorial analysis to see what contributes most and what contributes less to gender assignment. Of course, this is doable, but let's look at our study design in this way. Do we still see visible size effects across all other rules that overlap over the size, so interact with the size? And I think that our results show that even though the assignment rules are much more complex than just size, we still in some languages can detect size effects. And I think we should interpret this statistical outcomes in exactly this way. We still can see some size. I don't know whether it's clear or not. Oh, I can't hear you.
We can't hear you. I think it's much more clearly. Thank you, Mikhail. Thank you so much for very interesting presentation and for these clarifications. We are now have to move to our speaker. I think.
Thank you very much again for your invitation, and I wanted we wanted all to say a big, huge thank you to Olga Fedorova who consulted us as to some parts of the experiment design.